Welcome to Community Express. I'm Deanna Zachary. Today on the show, we're talking about the Pogonip Park in Santa Cruz. Heroin dealing is on the rise in the park, and some advocates believe that a new trail would bring more pedestrians and bikers to the park and encourage heroin dealers to move elsewhere. Then we'll discuss Measure H on the November ballot. Measure H calls for an increase in the utility tax, and the money would go for police officers and park rangers. Finally, we'll explore the latest in brain research. Why do we remember sad things more than happy things? And what are the differences between men's and women's brains? And can we change our brains? To discuss the Pogonip Park, we welcome Celia Scott to the show. She was on the Santa Cruz City Council when the Pogonip Master Plan was passed. She's also an environmental lawyer and a former mayor. Celia Scott, tell us about this new plan. The plan is to build a trail, 1.5-mile trail through the Pogonip in order to make more pedestrians and bikers go through the park so that heroin addicts will move out of the park. Is that the big picture?
Well, I guess you might say that's the big picture. The primary purpose of this trail, as I understand it, and has been stated by the Director of Parks and Recreation, is public safety. And it's important to understand that we're talking about the very edge of Pogonip. We're not talking about the whole property. And the ranger, John Wallace, made that point at the community meeting a few weeks ago, pointing out that that's the only part of the park that is really an issue. And I use the word park. I would like to just clarify that Pogonip is the largest, and some people consider it the crown jewel of the Santa Cruz Greenbelt lands. It's not just an ordinary park. It was preserved for its natural habitat, for its beauty, and its just remarkable range of views and open space. So it's sort of not like a little park.
Yeah.
It's something really special in our community.
Yeah. So getting the debate is all about the trail. People are saying, yes, we want a trail in order to get more people into the park, it sounds like, and in order to make a connection between downtown and getting towards the campus. Is that maybe lay out what you see?
Well, I think myself, there's a little bit of confusion about these purposes. The primary purpose, as I said, I believe, is to deal with a public safety issue that has arisen with drug dealing on Pogonip, which is something that has really increased tremendously just in the last few years. Associated with it, but not, as I understand it, the primary purpose, is the purpose of connecting what's called the University Connector Trail, which comes down from the campus and connects down to Highway 9 more directly with downtown. This, of course, means a lot of trail that's off the Pogonip, because once you get to the bottom of this proposed trail, you're actually on Golf Club Drive. You have to go down to Highway 9, you have to cross Highway 9, you have to ride along the river levee. It's not like the whole project is really on Pogonip. So
some of the money that they're talking about spending is to make a trail in town itself, not just...
Well, the trail is there, but there are things off the Pogonip site that are going to have to be dealt with. It's proposed actually as a multi-use trail: horses, bikers, pedestrians. There's no clear place for horse fans to stage, so it's not at all clear how that's going to happen. And one of the concerns that some of us have is that the project, before it was sent from the Planning Commission to the Parks Commission to the City Council, really wasn't a fully developed project. So that's now happening in the process of doing the environmental analysis of the impacts of this proposed trail.
Okay.
It's important to understand that there are a lot of people who use Pogonip. It isn't really getting more people in everywhere. It's just this particular route, which has, because of its relationship to the rail line, actually has enabled, it's been a spot where drug dealers have been able to go into the Pogonip, but off the rail line and off Highway 9.
So help us think through this argument about bringing more people along this rail line would make the heroin dealers move. Because one thought that comes to mind is, can't they just go deeper into the park or behind a tree or something? I mean, if they like to be in that area because it works for their business, why would they move to a completely different part of town and not deeper into the park?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and that's one of the major issues. What evidence is there that this is going to actually have the effect of increasing public safety? And it's reasonable to consider several things. First of all, drug dealing takes place all over the city of Santa Cruz, on Pacific Avenue. It takes place along the river levee, and this trail will connect the river levee directly with Pogonip in a way in which it is not now. But what we've discovered is that the access takes place off the rail line. People come off the rail line. They've created little side trails that go into the Pogonip off the rail line. And to us, it makes a lot more sense to look at, and that's what we're trying to do right now, very seriously consider an alternative to this for a bicycle route right along the rail line itself. It's already used by bicyclists. All you have to do is go out there and you can see it. And it also has a connection that's already there, a trail connection, up to what's called the Rincon Trail, which then goes up to the university.
Okay, so let me summarize.
Yeah,
so,
it's hard to do this without a map. But
yeah. So the proposal is 1.5 miles,
yes,
some of which is in the Pogonip. And
all of that is in the Pogonip.
And it's a new dirt path.
That's
and
right.
Your argument is, let's not do that new one. Let's already use land next to the railway and paths that have already been set up to go where you want to go.
Well, I think the argument is it's complex. The rail line, of course, is not owned by the city of Santa Cruz. It's owned by the Big Trees Railway Company. There was a study that was done by the county of Santa Cruz in 2006, a very detailed study of the feasibility of putting a really constructed bicycle path right along the rail line all the way to Felton. And that study is still in existence. We've got a copy of it, but it was not actually done. So what we would like to see is just to back up a little bit here and look at the possible alternatives. Because there are a lot of trails on Pogonip. It's not like there aren't trails on Pogonip, but there's only one that's a multi-use trail that includes horses and pedestrians and bicyclists. And that's the trail coming up from Highway 9, part of which is actually an old road, and then this thing called the Yukon Trail, which goes up to the university. And without getting into the issue of hikers versus cyclists, to me the real question is this really going to make a difference in the public safety issues on the Pogonip? Because that to me is really the primary problem. Nobody wants to have a portion of our greenbelt land subject to drug dealing, subject to the potential for fires, a whole series of things which we just don't want to have happen in our community. So how do we deal with this?
And what's your thinking? What's the best way to deal with it?
Well, my thinking is that we look at the alternatives instead of just zeroing in on this one idea. And I think that's what the environmental review process should now do.
What are some alternatives that are interesting to you?
Well, as I said, the main one is to have bicycles along the rail line, which is where the drug dealers get access, off the rail line itself. So if that's going to be of help to have more activity there, that seems like the logical place to look first to see whether that's a possibility.
Okay, a bike trail along the railway.
Right.
We only have a few minutes left. Where are we at in the political process? What's going to happen from here?
Well, the City Council accepted a recommendation of the Parks Commission to go forward with the environmental review process. There's a certain amount of money that's been set aside for that. An environmental consultant, Stephanie Strelo, has been hired. She is now going to be looking at this and putting together an environmental document.
Paid for by Measure H funds.
Well, I don't know that it's really Measure H funds.
Okay, I had read that.
I've heard that too, but there's a little bit of confusion there, I think.
Okay.
In any case, it's funds that are available, just what they're called discretionary funds in the Parks Department.
Okay.
So those funds are there. That's going to be paid for.
They're going to study it.
They're going to study it,
months.
and that's right. And the question is, are they going to do a really thorough study which looks at these alternatives, looks at what kind of evidence is there that just putting more people on a trail on this part of Pogonip is really going to have an effect in reducing the public safety dangers that we have out there now.
I'd like to thank our guest, Celia Scott. She's a former mayor of Santa Cruz, an environmental lawyer, and a member of Friends of Pogonip. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Up next, Measure H. It's on the ballot for the November election and calls for an increase in the utility tax. The money would go for police officers and park rangers. Stay tuned.
Hi, we are the Board of Directors of Community TV of Santa Cruz County.
And we want to invite you to our first fundraiser.
We're raising funds to fill this truck with television equipment that will allow us to cover youth sports and bring back the Game of the Week.
Join us Friday, October 1st from 6 to 9 at the studios of Community Television.
We'll see you there!
Measure H is on the November ballot in Santa Cruz, and it calls for an increase in the utility tax. The money would go to fund public safety like more police and park rangers. We've invited two guests to the show. Cynthia Mathews is on the Santa Cruz City Council and another former mayor. Tom Mullen is a retired dentist in Santa Cruz. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. Cynthia, start us out with a little description, a kind of summary of Measure H. We've had a utility tax now for many years. This is just an increase. Tell us a bit about it.
That's true. Measure H is a local revenue measure on the Santa Cruz City ballot, restricted to the city. And what it would do would be to generate funds to help support public safety in the city of Santa Cruz. You're correct, there has been a utility tax in the city of Santa Cruz since 1984. And that was reaffirmed by voters in the early 2000s. But I think all your viewers will acknowledge that the city of Santa Cruz has had an ongoing fiscal challenge, to put it gently. And we understand that public safety is one of the community priorities. Public safety is already 2/3 of our general fund expenditure. We've been hard pressed to meet the demand for public safety within our budget constraints. So we don't regard Measure H as a single silver bullet, but we think it's a very important strategy among many to help provide ongoing public support, that is funding for public safety.
And now, currently the tax is at 7%.
That's correct.
On utilities. Like what utilities?
Utilities, PG&E, water, trash collection, telecommunications, cable TV.
And the proposal is to go to 8.5%.
8.5%, yes. And for the average household in the city of Santa Cruz, that would be about $5 or $6 a month.
Okay.
Just to get a sense of proportion.
Right. Tom, you're not super excited about this new increase. Give us your perspective.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm not opposed to this because it affects me personally. In fact, the way it's written, as a senior, I probably wouldn't even have to pay it. But I object to it because I don't think it's in the best interest of the city. We already have one of the highest tax rates in the nation. We have one of the highest sales tax, 9.5%. We have one of the highest utility tax. I just don't think this is a way to attract business to Santa Cruz by saying, come to Santa Cruz. We have some of the highest taxes in the nation. But I also don't think it's fair for the people of Santa Cruz, the hardworking people who have to pay this tax, and everybody is not going to have to pay this tax, when they're going to have to subsidize, which I think everybody agree are outrageously high pensions that are killing the city of Santa Cruz. We have encouraged with some of our sanctuary city policies illegal drug dealers to come in and flourish in the city. We encourage and invite transients from all over the United States to come to the city, and these are extremely expensive things. And this is one of the things that cause the expenses in Santa Cruz to be so high. One of the reasons I think we have to have so many police. I would like to see things done to reduce the need for some of these police. Now, another thing that I think is confusing about this issue, you mentioned the 8.5%. The problem with this is it's not actually 8.5%. If you look at your utility bill, the amount of tax that you pay on water is 11.5% because there's an extra franchise tax tossed in there that's not actually even mentioned in the measure. There's 11.5 tax.
Maybe let's get Cynthia to respond to that.
Well, let me just finish the numbers and see if Cynthia agrees. 11.5% on gas and an unbelievable 20.5% on refuge. And maybe Cynthia will agree or not agree to that.
Cynthia.
I don't know the details of those, but what we're talking about is the utility tax.
This is utility tax.
Well.
I have my bill right here in my packet right here. I can show
Okay.
you. That's what it all adds up to be. And see, that's what's confusing, and it's disturbing that these things are somewhat misleading when these measures are put in the ballot. It doesn't say. It says, like you saw, 8.5% will go to, but it doesn't mention the franchise tax that's in there, and it's right there. I can show you.
And the franchise tax, in your mind, goes to
These all go to the general fund.
They go to the general fund.
And I have to say, you can't provide public services with no money. And we have heard so loud and clear from the public. You mentioned attracting business to Santa Cruz. We talk to businesses, whether they're tourist-related businesses in the beach area or retail and restaurants downtown or all over the city. They say the primary concern of us as business people and of our customers is safety. And so we're getting very strong support from the business community for Measure H. They realize that the ability to do preventive action, respond to calls, is essential to providing the commitment to public safety that this community wants.
And in fact, the police were already hired, right? So this is in order to pay them. Weren't additional police already?
See, this is what's so confusing on this too, and this is one of the problems we get into. When you read this, it basically simply says this money is going into the general fund. But the city council says, don't pay attention to that. We really have made a pledge to do it for the police, to add these additional police officers, or the 8 police officers, which I agree, we probably do need those. But why don't we just say that we are going to put a measure on the ballot to hire 8.5 new police officers, and we'll do this for 5 years. We'll try to correct some of these other problems that I mentioned to reduce the need for police officers. Then I think you get a broader support. Why don't we just have it simply for the police officers and not this confusing issue that will go into the general fund?
Can you explain that? The language is that it goes to the general fund. Why not write it such that it goes to public safety?
Explicitly. Well, for one thing, that would take a 2/3 vote rather than a simple majority. That's one reason. I think you can have a whole argument on the tyranny of the minority, where 1/3 of people can block something that nearly 2/3 of the others want. So this is a simple majority measure. It goes directly into the general fund. And
explain that a bit. So if you just increase a tax that already exists, you need a majority, but if you change language, you need 2/3?
If you institute a tax of any sort, whether it's transient occupancy tax, sales tax, whatever, if you do that as a general tax that goes into the general fund, that takes a simple majority. If you do it for a specific purpose, as we did a couple years ago for the library tax, it was a 1/4 cent increase in the sales tax countywide to go to the libraries. That was a specific tax, and that took 2/3.
And you're guessing that you're not going to get 2/3 of the voters.
You know, it's more of a threshold, but the fact is, as I said, public safety is already 2/3 of our budget, and we are committed to meeting our public safety obligations to the greatest extent we humanly can. The other thing that I want to mention is the council did pass a resolution of intent. Now, admittedly, that's not binding on future councils, but I think the council's been really acted in good faith in the past. We did this on the previous Measure H several years ago. We said it's going to go to roads and it's going to go to park rangers, and that's where it has gone. So I think that's part of our commitment to voters.
Well, you know, that's one of the things that I speak in front of the city council many times is to try. I think the city council over the last 15 or 20 years has antagonized about 40 to 45% of the population by doing so many things that aren't really directed to the best interest of the city of Santa Cruz. There's various things on war issues, Patriot Act, very emotional issues that aren't related to the city. In fact, I remember one time I actually spoke out and said, "Why are you doing this? You're just antagonizing people. You are going to need these people."
Well, let's just focus on the utility taxes. I wanted to ask you about the exemptions for seniors and low-income folks.
Well, that's another thing that's so confusing about this.
There appears to be some debate about that.
Well, what happened was I was listening to the city council when they hastily put this on. It was so hastily put on that I think it should be totally redone. Here's the way I read what happened. They said, let's pass this. We have to do it right now because it has to be done by Friday or something. They said, well, what about senior citizens? Well, we'll decide that later. Well, what about disabled people? Well, we'll decide that later. What about other people that we
Low-income
money.
folks. Cynthia,
it's
would
just too vague. So
Okay,
basically what's
let's have
happening,
Cynthia
it's one last thing. We are voting, people are trying to vote on something that's not even complete.
You're feeling it's just not clear. Cynthia, what about that?
We are, this is being taped on September 12th, and we will be voting at our, if I got the date right, we will be voting at our meeting tomorrow on a resolution that sets the exemption rates. So
it'll be clear
It will be
tomorrow.
very clear. So what we're talking about is there is currently an exemption for low-income residents who qualify for the PG&E low-income program. And so our proposal is to increase that and to create a similar program for any senior who requests it. Our proposal is age 65 and over, by virtue, and that's simply by virtue of age. It's not related to income. So that, you know, some seniors say, I don't need the exemption, I'm not even going to qualify. They do that for schools and other things, but it will be eligible, available to those who want it. So we are increasing we propose, and this is in the resolution that the council will act on tomorrow, we propose to increase the exemption for low-income residents and to extend the same exemption to seniors who request it. And we have also made the commitment explicitly, we will publicize this widely, and the process will be very user-friendly.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both so much for joining us today, talking about Measure H on the November ballot in the city of Santa Cruz. We've been talking with Cynthia Mathews. She is a former mayor and a city council member, and also Tom Mullen. He's a retired dentist. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Up next, a look at some of the latest, most surprising research about our brains. Why do we remember sad things more than happy things? What are the latest thoughts about human consciousness? And how can we improve our brains? Stay tuned for a look at our brains. We'll be right back. We're talking about the latest discoveries in brain research. Our guest is Bruce Bridgeman. He's a professor of psychology and psychobiology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He specializes in vision and the brain. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you.
Nice to have you here. Let's start with remembering sad things more than happy things, because that's always been kind of shocking to me. So it is true that we do remember sad things more than happy things. Why is that?
I think we remember important things, and the most important things are probably those that challenge us. And over the course of evolution, people who paid a lot of attention to those challenges were those who became our ancestors.
So if you're in the cave and you're going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, you better remember what it's like right before you're going to get eaten or something like that. Whereas
Or remember how to get away or whatever.
right, how to get away.
But people also remember important happier occasions, such as people remember their weddings or the births of their children, important events like that. So it's not like a tape recorder that records everything you ever experience, but rather it is biased toward putting more effort on the important things, or those things you perceive to be important in your life.
Well, I was interested about the sad things too, because there's so many people who may have experienced a trauma. We hear now a lot of folks with post-traumatic stress disorder coming back from the war. And historically, we've always heard you should tell the story over and over again, kind of in a purging way, that's a therapeutic way. But really, the new research is suggesting it's not good to tell the story over and over again. Tell us about that.
Well, again, memory is not like a tape recorder. You don't simply play the memory back, but rather every time you bring it up, there is a new event. That is the event of having remembered it. So that adds to the memory that you already had, and that just becomes a bigger and bigger piece of your memory event.
So that's interesting. So if I tell a story 30 times, it's like I'm reliving it. There's 30 places in my brain for that story.
Well, and over time they get knitted together. It's a process called consolidation. So for instance, right after a traumatic event, for instance, an automobile accident, a person will have an amnesia. They'll forget what happened just before that event because their memory is still volatile in their brain. Over time it gets recoded. So people in an auto accident don't forget what happened last month, but they forget what happened a minute before the accident. And usually that knits itself back together as that memory consolidates. But there is a process of recoding. In a tape recorder, once things are down, they're down, and that's it. But in the brain, your brain keeps working over things even after they've been experienced, keeps recoding them. Our memories are coded in terms of other memories, addressed by their content rather than by some location or some time.
So that suggests that perhaps memory is not so good. If it's being recoded, maybe you're retelling the story and you start to change the story a little bit, or, you know, is that true?
That happens too. Memory is systematically distorted over time. Memories get simplified usually.
So we can't really, does that mean we can't really trust the story anymore that we tell?
In a sense, you can never trust it 100%. It used to be the case that eyewitness testimony was seen as the ultimate proof of legal necessity. But it's been shown over the past couple of decades that that memory is notoriously unreliable, that people change their stories, they change their own memory. It's not a matter of dishonesty, but simply of your brain changing the coding of that memory to, for instance, be consistent with other memories or to be easier to encode.
So your brain is recoding with other information, and it's not like you're trying to forget something, it's forgetting something or changing the story.
Right. The process of memory is an active process. It's not simply a passive recording of an event.
Mm-hmm. And what I find so shocking about that, say with the post-traumatic stress disorder, that you don't want to tell the story over and over again because it's like you're reliving it, that kind of flies in the face of all psychology. I mean, it would be asking folks, okay, don't see a therapist and retell the story. It would call for a different therapeutic approach. Is that true? Are we ready to say therapy?
I think for some things like post-traumatic stress, this is usually a consequence of some lengthy traumatic event, which is something that we're not psychologically prepared for. Evolution hasn't prepared us for emergencies that last for months or years, as in soldiers in wars. So often these things will affect people's brains in pathological ways that we can't deal with by ordinary kinds of therapies that work for other things.
Mm-hmm. What would be a good therapy then, do you think, given our brains?
Well, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I can't give any advice. But I think providing alternatives is the important thing to create a context in which a person can move on with their lives.
Alternatives like focusing on other aspects of their life or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. You've talked a little bit about this, the evolution, and I'm just interested, you know, how long does it take? You probably can't answer this, but if we have brains that have been formed over millions of years and they're used to not having a long war, but more of a short event, you know, chasing or being chased by some scary animal, how long might it take for the rewiring to happen to get used to long wars or changes in the way we live?
This would happen only if those who survive these episodes and come back healthier have more children than those who don't. Whether that happens is very problematic, and whether it happens consistently for centuries is even more problematic. So my best guess would be that you're not going to get much from evolution in the next 10,000 years or so, and maybe never.
So whatever we've got, we've got.
Pretty much, at least in that aspect.
And tell us more about what we've got in here, and maybe even mention there's more and more research about gender differences. I've heard a lot about different amounts of oxytocin in women's brains, so they experience love or children differently. Can you talk about what you know about differences in male and female brains?
Well, I think the first thing to mention is that there's enormous variability in both men and women. Men are slightly more variable than women are, but there's a big overlap in most of the characteristics of men's and women's brains. There are some differences in the way women's brains are connected up. There's a connection between the two hemispheres. I can show you here in the brain model how that works. This is a plastic model. It's about twice as big as a real brain. A real brain's fairly small. But we can take this apart.
Oops.
And I can show you a piece of the brain that connects the two hemispheres. So there are two separate pieces of cortex. If you're crawling around in the cortex, you can only crawl around in one half. To get to the other side, there's a tract of fibers. This tract here called the corpus callosum. It's just a very large tract of fibers that connects every place in one side of the brain to every place corresponding on the other side. And this tract is actually larger in women than it is in men.
How would that manifest?
That would manifest in putting things together, putting together sequential and simultaneous things differently in women than in men.
What might be an example?
A different sort of time perspective, perhaps.
A different time perspective. Can you say more about that, or some examples of what it would be to have a bigger spot there?
Corpus callosum.
Corpus callosum.
Well, the integration of the brain is different in men and women. So men can separate things out to put things in different compartments more easily. Women will tend to put things more together. But again, it's a relatively small effect compared to all the things your brain is doing. So I think we should emphasize the similarities rather than these relatively small differences.
Although we were talking once before, and I was kind of curious, we were talking about in evolution, women would have had children all of their lives and probably died in childbirth at a younger age than the men. And that might have impacted how men and women relate, because how we got here, my memory was that I said something about it. Well, it seems like when a relationship is over or there's been a death, the husband lost the wife, you always hear the stereotype of the man moving on. Within a month or two, he's dating again, he's remarried in a year. And you were saying that evolutionarily, that makes some sense. Explain that a bit more.
Well, I think the role of women is qualitatively different than it was in the historic period up to the Industrial Revolution. That is, historically, in order to have a 99% chance of 2 surviving children, you had to have 6 live births and perhaps 7 pregnancies altogether. And each one of those, of course, is the 9 months plus several years of nursing a child, because baby food hadn't been invented yet. So if the child's going to survive, you need a couple more years. So this means 3 or 4 years for each child. And 6 of those times 4 is 24 years. You start this around age 20. If you're lucky, you live to be 50 in those days. So the result was that most women were engaged in either pregnancy or nursing young children for most of their adult lives. Today, we live maybe 80 years. Out of that, 20 is necessary for 2 live births and bringing those children up to maturity. The other 60 are for you. So instead of the woman's role being restricted to child raising and not much else, there is a whole world of new possibilities that's opened up by the entrance of
birth control,
of birth control, of caring for children without large death rates. So to have 2 children now surviving to adulthood, you have 2 children.
And how would that differentiate a man and woman's brain if what they did for millions of years were very different tasks?
So the woman's job was to create security and to create bonding among the family so that the family is committed to its members, whereas the man's role was to provide for the woman at a time when she was not economically self-sufficient, which was, again, most of the time. So this division of sex roles was built into our brains in a way. It evolved. It made us enormously more successful than other primates, where the male has practically no role in supporting a family.
Say, like, why are we more successful than primates?
Because every human child has 2 parents, whereas the chimpanzee child or the monkey child has 1 parent.
Because the male is off doing something else.
Right.
And so does that mean we evolved more as humans than the primates were able to evolve?
We evolved differently. I can't say we evolved more. They've gone through as many generations of evolution as we have, maybe more, but they evolved in different directions.
Your research is on vision. I don't know if you want to point to the brain or maybe explain vision a little bit, how vision works, and then tell us about your research.
Okay, well, we can look at the brain here. This is the inside half of the brain. The inside half of the brain. And this is the outside side view of the brain. If we look here, this is where the eyes would be. If we turn the brain around, we can see the optic nerve running up here into the middle of the brain where there's some extra processing going on. And from there, information radiates out back to the back part of the cortex in here, where the fibers that are coming from the retina to the middle and back out here wind up, and they bring visual information into the cortex. We used to think there was one visual brain back here and one kind of central retina, but now we know there are more than 20 visual areas, more than 20 maps of the retina on the cortex, which splay out across the outer surface all along here and down into this part for perception and up into this part for visually guided behavior.
So there's not one section, there's 20 areas in our brain that are doing something when we're seeing.
Right. The surprising thing is that we see one world and one coherent vision of things when all these areas are active and performing different roles.
And your research shows that there's two very different systems of sight. One is, well, I'll let you explain it.
Well, the idea starts from the insight that there are two qualitatively different kinds of things that vision does. One is to look around the world. When you ask people what they see, they tell you what's in one system, which gives us information about people and events and layout of the world. But it's not used immediately for behavior. It's used for memory, for planning future behaviors, but not immediately. There's another pathway, which we're not aware of, which will have quantitative information about where things are, but in a very simplified format. So the two jobs are, one, to perceive what's in the world, and two, to drive visually guided behavior in real time. So if I close my eyes and grab something like this, I can know exactly where that is, whereas if you ask me how many feet away is that, or how many arm lengths, or any other measure, I'll be a little bit off. But if you ask me to grasp it, I'll be accurate.
So you have almost a body knowledge different from a cognitive knowledge? Is that
right.
What you're saying?
So there's a perceptual system that gives you your experience, and there's an extra system that has information that you're not aware of, that's quantitatively calibrated, that tells you where the objects of your behavior are, where the objects of grasping or throwing or reaching will be.
And if one of the segments gets knocked out, like the perception of what's in the room and you're wearing blue, you know, if that gets knocked out, I still might have the ability to grab something. And,
right.
Yeah.
Yes. This was discovered in a patient who had carbon monoxide poisoning and lost her visual perception. She was legally blind, couldn't really make out much of anything. But it turned out that when you gave her a slot to put her hand through, she could actually reach accurately through the slot without touching it, no matter what its orientation was. If you ask her what the orientation was, she would be random. She'd have no idea. So this showed that there's information in the brain that's beyond perception or different from perception. And what we've been doing in our laboratory is taking clinical results like that and applying them to intact people, to undergraduates, and asking, how do these two systems work when they're both there?
So you work with undergraduates, you work with their brains to kind of map these places?
What we do is we work on the behavioral level. So we ask people to reach for things or to describe things. And we find that there are situations in which we can pull the perception and the action apart so that people will perceive something in one place and reach for it somewhere else and hit it.
You were saying something really interesting at one point that I heard about vision and folks who were blind, maybe in the third world. They were blind and then they acquired vision through some kind of surgery, or maybe they had cataracts and then they got vision later in life. And some of the people hate it. They find it very disturbing. What happens? I mean, we assume that you can't see and then you get vision and your life would be great. And there are examples where that's not true.
Well, when people are born blind or become blind very early in life, when their brain is still flexible, their brain organizes itself around the other senses and not around vision. So the areas that in us are visual cortex, that area in the back of the brain over here, is something that in them is organized for nearby space, but not for vision. So there'll be an auditory response in those areas. Normal people have an auditory response also, but it's overwhelmed by the visual response. And the tactile areas will also increase in importance. So when those people have vision restored, for instance, if they have cataracts that are removed after this period of flexibility when they're adults, their brains are not equipped to process vision in the same way that ours are. That is, their eyes might be completely normal, but the brain that's processing the information coming from the eyes is no longer capable of doing the processing that would happen in us. So
do they get overwhelmed by too many sights or something?
There are reports of that sort of thing. There are also people who say that the geometry of the world isn't what they thought it was, that things are dirty, they're cluttered, they weren't aware of all the clutter that's around us. In fact, we're not aware of it most of the time ourselves. So they become aware. They're able to immediately recognize things that they've had a direct tactile information about. So for instance, if they've felt a doorknob, they can recognize a doorknob. But if you ask them to recognize an automobile, that's something they haven't had any tactile experience with, so that's more difficult. And some people have actually gone back to operating as blind people in those cases.
They would put something over their eyes to block out the vision because they can't deal with...
Or simply ignore their vision, make a decision. And some people have even committed suicide because they were so disoriented by that whole experience.
That's amazing. Yeah. What are some of the new discoveries in brain research that you get excited about?
Well, one thing is this multiplying of visual brain areas, that there are so many different specialized areas in the brain doing different things. We started out with areas that did sensory things, areas that did motor things. This was done actually about 130, 140 years ago by stimulating the brains of soldiers whose brains were exposed in the Franco-Prussian War. And every war since then has given a big supply of brain-injured, otherwise healthy people whose brains have been investigated. But it turned out that in some areas you could stimulate and a person would see a light or they'd hear a sound. Other places you'd stimulate and they'd move something, move an arm, move a leg. But 3/4 of the brain, you got neither of those things. So what were they? Well, you asked the philosophers who were thinking about what happens in mental life, and their idea was that mental life is the association of ideas, putting ideas together. So these got called association areas, and that term is still around, although I think it should be obsolete. Drives me nuts that it's still around, because over time those association areas have gotten smaller and smaller. That is, we discovered that, well, some of those areas that weren't active are actually secondary visual areas that are only activated if there's something coming from the primary visual cortex into those areas. So for instance, there are specialized areas doing color, doing motion, doing a lot of other more specialized visual tasks that somehow get put together. There are areas in the front of the brain up here that are organizing motor activity.
So let me just say that back to you. So what you were saying is there's different areas of the brain that identify color, or it's just each little area does something different.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
the surprise is that there's no single area that gives us everything that we perceive. So the color area doesn't have the resolution that we perceive when we look out in the world.
So resolution is coming from one area of the brain and color is coming from another area of the brain?
Right. The motion area doesn't know much about color.
And why is that
get put together.
exciting to you?
Because somehow this all gets put together, we still don't know how, into a coherent perception.
And are you investigating how it all comes together? Or it sounds like it touches on philosophy.
Well, what we're doing right now is looking at what these various areas do and how we can split up these functions in normal people and pull them apart.
I've heard that there's some new research about consciousness. It sounds like you're getting a little bit in that direction that suggests that when we do things, it's out of our subconscious. We move or start activities, and it's not like our logical mind is deciding to do something, but maybe our subconscious is deciding it. Can you explain that?
Well, consciousness.
Can you explain consciousness?
No. I can dig around the edges of it, but I can't explain consciousness. But this idea of consciousness is related to the idea of free will, that we have a will that we can do things and that they're not caused by anything in the environment, but they're caused by some I inside me.
Right. I want to interview you.
Right.
I call you.
I want to do something. I want to buy a car. I want to do something else. But in the neurological sense, that's impossible because we know that neurons are driven only by other neurons and by hormones, which are inside the body. A few of them are driven by outside events. But there's always a cause to each effect. Each neuron is driven by other neurons, sensory neurons, or other influences, but there's no uncaused action. So free will is, in a sense, an uncaused action. How do we get free will? Well, one alternative is that free will is an illusion. That is, we think we have free will, but actually things are driven by other processes. When we look at the brain, we can record from morning till night from cells in the brain, and we never find ones that correspond exactly to what we're aware of. There's always some difference between what a cell knows and what we experience. So the vast majority of what's going on in the brain is unconscious. There are some small areas in the frontal lobes, which are up here, which are more likely involved in the sorts of memory processes that result in consciousness.
Let me stop you for a second and say that back to you. So the vast majority of the brain is working on an unconscious level and only small parts on a conscious level. And those unconscious levels, what are they doing? Are they just making your body go, or they're not really thought?
Well,
or are they?
The idea is that everything that you do is driven by unconscious influences that drive your behavior. And the radical view of this from Michael Gazzaniga, another neuroscientist, is that everything we do is unconscious. And there's a part of your brain up in this part right here that looks at your behavior as though from a third party, as though from the outside, and tells a story about what you're doing and makes a consistent story about this behavior.
So there would be an action. Maybe I'd do an action and I would do it unconsciously, and then another part of my brain would make a story, a coherent narrative about what I just did.
Right, in a sense.
And that would happen like in a nanosecond. So I did something and now I'm telling myself the story of what I did?
Right, or in a period of a few seconds, this would become linked to other memories and other events in your life. And that story then would be used by other parts of the brain, unconscious parts, to drive behavior in the future. And that's why this area evolved in the first place.
It sounds like we're just chemical soup. Like our brains are just doing things we have no idea they're doing, and maybe making us act in ways that we're not aware of.
So the idea is that then that consciousness is an illusion, but we only know about illusions because we can get caught. So for instance, when you look at a visual illusion, like there's the Miller-Lyer illusion, the one with the arrows that go in, and you compare that to a line with the arrows that go out. We know that's an illusion because we can get a ruler and measure it.
They look like different lines.
You were wrong. This line's actually the same as that line, and then it's an illusion. But if you're never caught, it's not an illusion at all, because to you it was reality. If no one contradicts that, it remains reality forever. So free will, consciousness can become reality, even if they're based on something very different in the brain.
So the extension of this, I mean, does it kind of shock you and make you rethink everything if consciousness is an illusion?
In a way it does, but in a way it's a level of explanation. It's not a satisfactory one because you'd like to be conscious of what those things are. And what we're saying is that that's forever impossible.
It's kind of mind-boggling. We only have a few more minutes. I want to jump to something else. A big book this year, or the last couple of years, Jill Bolte Taylor had a stroke, and she's a neuroscientist, and she felt herself have the stroke, lost all her ability to call for help on the phone, things like that. But she was experiencing a lot of beauty and joy, and it sounds like ecstasy during the stroke and for weeks on out. And her argument was that it killed the parts that were worried and nervous and type A behavior, and somehow the part of the brain that is joy was left.
There is actually some evidence that there are areas in the brain that handle reward, dopamine systems that are in the brain. We talked about the chemical soup idea. I think of the brain as part logical engine and part chemical soup. And these reward areas are deep down in the brainstem in the bottom of the brain. That is, if we look at the brain, we can look at the oldest parts of the brain that are here. If I can get this apart.
We only have like a minute or two left for this important joy part of the brain.
So the bottom parts of the brain, these are the oldest parts of the brain. And if you stimulate cells in these parts of the brain down here, you'll get rewarded. That is, people like that stimulation, or rats like that stimulation. So these are reward centers in very ancient parts of the brain. And if those remain while the cortex is damaged by the stroke, Jill's stroke was in the areas up here in the more higher part of the brain.
So she was left with those.
Then she has an imbalance of the reward areas that are deeper in the brain.
We have to wrap up, but it makes you think, is there a way that you could go into your own brain and kind of focus on the joy area and expand it and put less attention on the...
Probably not a good idea, because you'd wind up walking in front of cars, doing other things that danger alerts you to, and that your brain has evolved to handle.
Okay. Thank you so much. We've been talking with Bruce Bridgeman. He's a professor of psychology and psychobiology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He specializes in vision and the brain. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks to Community Television of Santa Cruz County, to Daniel James Howell and Ryan Mulligan for helping to produce the show, and all the volunteers that make the show happen. Tune in each month as we explore issues affecting the nation, the state, but especially Santa Cruz County. I'm Deanna Zachary. Thanks for watching.